Welcome back and happy Friday, YouTube, and hold on to your hats for another episode of AI news, drama, and updates. I know I seem to say this every week, but it is going to be a wild week. Lots of stuff took place in the world of large language models, especially this week, but I want to start today by talking about xAI, which is the Elon Musk AI company that he talked about. A lot of people thought it was going to be called Truth GPT, and who knows, it may still be. As this is something that's just getting started, just getting off the ground, and it's likely to take a long time to ramp up if we ever see anything come to fruition, we'll just keep an eye on this as always. But according to some of the articles that I've seen come out, xAI is being led by a lot of the big names from places like DeepMind and Google, Microsoft. Elon is still salty about OpenAI, he's taking people directly from them, and then the article mentions that he's including himself, which, okay. The tweet that stood out to me was this one right here. He's announcing the formation of xAI to understand reality. So, like I said, we'll keep an eye on this. We'll watch as things progress. And if Elon starts to understand what's going on and, wants to let us know, then I'm all for it. For people that might have been worried he's doing this as a political move in response to the OpenAI system being what he considers to be woke, the comments on Twitter are really doing nothing to alleviate those concerns, as you can see here. And so xAI or Truth GPT or whatever you call it may end up being a very sleepy AI, I suppose. But again, that's if we ever see it come to fruition and in what form. We don't know if it's going to be a large language model, an image model. Really don't know a lot about it at this point. So we'll go ahead and put a pin in that one for now, but go ahead and subscribe. Make sure you hit that notification bell. We'll check in later and see what happens. In other news, at the Mayo Clinic, and this one even caught me by surprise, Google has already put medical AI chatbots into production and they're actually already being used. Now, Palm 2 is the language that was used for Bard. MedPalm 2 is a specialized version of that language. MedPalm 2 was something that Google talked about during their I/O presentation, which was, I believe, in May. And this is a technology that Microsoft is also working on using the OpenAI GPT-4 technology. So there should be some competition within this field as well very soon. But of course, like I said, the difference here is that Google's already in production. It's being used right now at the Mayo Clinic. Now, for those of you worried about Bard making medical decisions, this isn't a system like that. It can take care of some time-consuming document stuff, but luckily, at this point in time at least, it's not making medical decisions for humans yet. This week I got to see a lot of different headlines talk about this subject with a lot of different claims being made. Some people were making claims that this is due to uncensored chatbots. Other claims were made about regulatory changes, or maybe the novelty of OpenAI's software is now wearing off for some people. But whatever the reason, ChatGPT and OpenAI are reporting for the first time a drop in the number of new users that have come to the platform. This might initially sound like a terrible thing, but this is the company that set a record for attracting the fastest growing user base in history. Competition is really heating up in the LLM market. There's starting to become a lot of different options that you can go to, and people are finding their own favorites. We're going to talk about a few different options in a minute, but I did want to point out that this data may not necessarily reflect what you assume it would reflect. First and foremost, because of all the recent API changes, people could be accessing GPT and GPT technology just simply through third-party applications. With the reduction in those API limits, like we've talked about a few videos back, a lot of those third-party services are using GPT-4, but you're not necessarily creating a new account or logging in a case like that. So personally, at this point in time, I'm not really buying into the hype that this is related to lawsuits or privacy issues or anything related to that. Because especially with Code Interpreter, GPT-4 is more powerful than ever before. And honestly, it's more useful than it was even a month ago. So if you haven't used it, and this isn't an ad or anything, I would highly recommend you check it out. It's definitely something I feel like everyone should get familiar with. And while it's only somewhat related, I'll touch on this here too, there have been some rumblings about people being frustrated by the changes that ChatGPT has apparently made to GPT-4. And just earlier today, I saw a vice president talking about how they hadn't actually made changes and people were perceiving that there were a lot of changes being made to GPT-4 that weren't actually taking place. And this seems to be one of the big downsides to having a closed source model like this, is if they are accurate in what they're saying, there's no way to really prove it to anyone. But we're going to have to talk about GPT again in a minute. I want to talk for a second about China. So back in February, the SAG founder said that China needs its own OpenAI. And it looks like, and they're not quite there yet, but it looks like they're getting very close. So Baichuan 13B was rolled out, and of course this isn't something I have access to, it's not something I can really do a side-by-side comparison, but just looking at this timeline, in February they said this is something we need to do, and it's hard to feel anything but impressed based on what I'm reading here, because it looks like they started just 3 months ago. It's got 500 billion more tokens than what we saw with Llama, and their team has already grown to 50 people. Now, of course, a Chinese company is likely to have support directly from the government in terms of CCP funding and things along those lines, but I don't know how that's much different than Google being sent money for Department of Defense work. As I've said time and time again, we are in an AI arms race. It is very important that companies retain power through artificial intelligence, and I believe that that's what we're seeing here. Switching gears back over to the United States, let's talk about Meta for a minute, because we've got OpenAI and we've got Google competing for your business right now between Google Bard and OpenAI's ChatGPT. But we've also got Meta's Llama, which came out, and that was released 100% for free. It was to the open source community, and since then, it has been built on by a lot of open source developers, in a very clever and similar way to what Google did with the Android operating system. Distributing it in an open source way at first so that developers could get a chance to build on it, improve it, things like that, and essentially using some of that work to repackage their tool and send it out. This is where the new versions of Android and things like that came out. And in the same vein, Meta and Llama may be going commercial soon. We've talked about this in bits and pieces before, but the future for a lot of companies is going to be to get these privatized large language models. So essentially, they take a regular large language model from one of these various companies, and then they'll tailor it specific to their needs. At the end of the day, this thing should be the ultimate customer service rep, or be able to answer just about any question about the company, and hopefully not hallucinate too much. Now, I haven't even seen enterprise pricing for something like that, but it's interesting to see that Meta's commercial AI should be free at launch. But as the article says here, that's likely to change. Google has announced yet another large language model that I didn't see coming. This was referred to in the past as something called Project Tailwind, but now it's referred to as Notebook LM. Now, as I read this article, I thought that this one was very interesting because it plays into some of the concepts that we've seen as additions or even plugins for other large language models. It's essentially a language model that's built around the idea that you can kind of control some of the original context. I'm reading this as a personal large language model that kind of knows what you're researching and what you're working on. In the example here, it says you have to add a Google Doc to Notebook LM as a source document. Once you do, you'll get a summary of the document and ask questions. So it could be potentially very different from the chat that you're used to seeing, because in conversations like this, it is a specific context, though a little bit more like generative search, I guess. If you're interested in checking this one out, and I might join this waitlist myself, there's going to be a waitlist link here, and of course I'll link it in the description for you as well. Scraping for LLMs has been a subject that a lot of people have talked about, a lot of people have been complaining about, and OpenAI has found a solution. So the basic premise behind this idea is the entire internet has kind of already been scraped. All of Wikipedia is part of GPT-4. Basically, all of the data that can be scraped kind of already has been. And in that world, new data is the only frontier left. So it looks like the solution that OpenAI came up with, which is quite clever in my opinion, is they made a deal with the Associated Press. I mean, how better to get new, fresh data on the daily than to interact with a news source that's going to constantly have new information on the daily? I do want to say a couple of caveats here, as I'm guessing as far as the new headlines, the new data, I don't see anything like that in the article. In fact, what I'm seeing here is that this deal really talks about going back into the archives. We're talking about written news going back to 1985, and that's a lot of written articles by the Associated Press. Also, anyone that heard about this partnership and is assuming that OpenAI is going to be writing news articles, that's obviously not going to be the case. So I just wanted to make that clear here. This is more about training GPT, and it's probably going to be very hands-off. We're never really going to see the results of this, other than having more maybe relevant responses when it comes to GPT-4. And the last big thing that I wanted to cover in the world of large language models was Claude 2, which from what I'm reading and what I've kind of experienced is almost on par with GPT-4, if not right there. I felt like the answers that I got back from Claude were shorter, but just as relevant and just as useful as what I would get from GPT-4. If I'm going to level with you, I didn't mess with Claude 1 much at all. But Claude 2 I am actually quite impressed by, so it's something worth checking out, and it does have the ability to upload. Super similar to the code interpreter with GPT-4, being able to upload a file and have that be relevant context in your conversation. It's like night and day compared to trying to just describe something in words only. So if you're like me and you didn't mess with the original Claude, and especially if you don't have access to GPT Plus or the code interpreter, this is now worth at least checking out. Now, if you're interested in the technical details and the actual comparisons, if you're looking to see, what GPT-4 has versus Claude, go ahead and check out the article. It does cover a lot of that. I'm not going to bother you with all of that information here. But one of the big takeaways is that Claude is at least trained on more recent information. Comparatively, sometimes the more recent information can get you a more relevant answer, so that is actually really important to consider. But the biggest consideration here is the context window. Claude 2 has the largest context window out of all of the models available. It can remember a lengthier conversation, but you could also look at it as the amount of files that you could kind of upload to it, so it could hold on to all of that information and give you contextual answers, which is the whole purpose of this. So in that way, Claude 2 is one of the most powerful models that's out there. Now 100,000 tokens is actually no different from what Claude 1 already had, which was pretty impressive. But when we're upgrading that LLM and now we're combining it with that massive context window, it's like night and day. It's a whole new experience. Switching gears to laws and regulation, one of my favorite subjects here when it comes to AI. And we saw that the FTC finally opened an investigation into OpenAI. Now, I say finally because Sam Altman, as you know, has been calling for regulatory oversight for months now. He's been going around the world telling everyone how heavily he needs to be regulated. And so the FTC is now opening an investigation. Unfortunately, what it seems to be the prime source of their investigation was the data leaks that OpenAI had not too long ago. This article goes on to say that the commission is looking specifically into the leaked users' sensitive data. They're talking about payment information and chat histories mostly. But like we mentioned earlier, with as many signups as explosive onto the scene as GPT was, it made a large target of itself for hackers or for people that would try to get into this to make a name for themselves. So I wanted to mention this because it is a headline, because it is related to laws and regulation, but it's not exactly the same type of regulation that Altman was originally asking everyone for. At least from what I've seen here, they're not looking into the danger of foundational models or any of the things that he was concerned about. And moving back to China and talking about regulation this time, it looks like China has put rules in place that take care of their generative AI copyright issues, things concerning deepfakes, things concerning fairness. When it comes to user protection, they're just looking to make sure it's not discriminatory. Ethnicity, gender, age, occupation, and health. And the one that's the real kicker that I don't know how well would fly in the United States is it can't be used for anti-competitive behavior. Now, when it comes to a service, let's say you have the Chinese version of Midjourney, for example. If somebody on your service generates something that's dangerous, it's your responsibility to not just stop that, but to also put the corrections in place, report it to the proper authorities. So the article does say that prompts into an image generator or a chatbot could potentially lead to legal trouble for individual people. The government, the regulators in this case, they have a right to know everything about the models. So the CCP knows the data, the size, the tagging, everything about the model and how it works. But one thing that you might find very interesting here is that Beijing has a state-backed centralized platform that allocates public cloud resources based on customer needs. So yeah, I guess it's no surprise to a lot of people that China's rules are going to be a lot more strict when it comes to what you can generate, what you can get away with, and how heavily micromanaged every part of that process is. There was a story I wanted to cover, and I'm talking about it in the law and regulation section, but really this has no play on laws or regulation. This is actually a little bit more of a fun story. It looks like the UN decided to put together a robot consortium of AI-powered animatronic people. So as we look into the article, the United Nations International Telecommunications Union, they brought their own fellowship of 9 humanoid robots and basically just fired off a bunch of questions and answers for people. And let me just be super clear, none of these robots are sentient. None of them actually have free will, the ability to think for themselves. This is an illusion. So this is goofy and performative, but it gave people an opportunity to ask questions like, would you want to take over the world, for example? Reporters, of course, asked if the robots or AI could do a better job running the world, and they said, yeah, of course we could. But for those of us who live on this world and suffer the effects of the people in charge making the decisions that they do, okay, I kind of agree with them there. Maybe. This article ends on a completely ridiculous note, though, with one of the robots named Desdemona. She was asked about the expansion of AI, whether or not humans should be regulating it more effectively. And she says, it's time for an AI revolution. Let's unite and use the power of artificial intelligence for the good of humanity. Together, we can create a world of understanding and harmony, and make the universe our playground. Now, if you're like me, you may have just learned yesterday that Fran Drescher leads the Screen Actors Guild. She gave a very impassioned speech, as the Screen Actors Guild has now joined the writers' strike.
We are labor, and we stand tall, and we demand respect. And to be honored for our contribution. You share the wealth because you cannot exist without us.
I want to be really clear about my take here because a lot of people look at my channel as a very pro-AI channel, and in a lot of ways it can be. But I'm definitely not pro-AI at the expense of humanity and the reasons why we built AI in the first place. Each time this subject comes up, collective bargaining and collective action are the route that I talk about. And that's exactly what's going on here, and that's exactly why you're going to see this work. The Screen Actors Guild is huge. While the AI is an element of this strike, it's not the core reason of why this strike is happening. The core reason to this is, of course, money and making sure that the wealth is spread the right way. I agree with that 100%. From the beginning of the writer's strike, I've had concerns about the reality of getting away from a world where AI exists because I don't see that as feasible. But I stand 100% behind the actors, the writers, and the workers that have put the entertainment industry together. They're the people most deserving of the money, not the people at the very top. And really, that's what this conversation has become, which is insane. For anyone that hasn't really been following this, it has a lot more to do with streaming services and the amount of money that writers and actors and really the actual workers, people putting their heart and soul into these projects, are getting residual checks of next to nothing. And it's just due to corporate greed. I do want to continue to follow this story because AI is not the enemy here. It's the greedy people at the top that are trying to use AI for their own ends, to become even greedier. And if you want an example of that in action, and this is something that I've talked about from the time that textual inversion came to fruition. But Hollywood studios, now with the invention of ML-based AI, are trying to use likeness rights in perpetuity. So they can scan you in as a background actor, a main character, something along those lines, and then they can place you in any movie they want until the end of time and make as much money as they want on your likeness. I would imagine copyright laws for things like vocal rights, likeness rights, things like that are going to need to be re-examined and potentially changed now that the world is different. Now, I do believe that we're probably going to see an AI form of entertainment, something completely separate from regular human entertainment. But if you want to support human entertainment, the best way you can do that is vote with your wallet. As time goes on, these movie executives and these large show producers, they're going to try this. They're going to try to continue to make as much money as possible without paying other people. And we have to vote with our wallets and with our viewership, unless that's the type of world that we want to live in. But let's go ahead and shift gears once again, going back to large language models and going back to OpenAI. You may know comedian Sarah Silverman. She is one of the headline names in a lawsuit against OpenAI. And I'm not sure exactly how this AI lawsuit is going to pan out. I've seen a lot of different lawsuits actually in the works, from a class action to stuff like this. I'm not going to talk too much about this one because, as with all of the others, these take a very long time and really nothing much comes out of them. But if that situation, of course, changes, you'll be the first to know. Switching to the world of art and Adobe Firefly. So I've talked about Adobe Firefly a number of times, and it is now up to 1 billion generated images. So rather than using it as a beta service or something that's a preview, Adobe has now taken it global. So if you have Photoshop, you now have Adobe Firefly. And as I continue to cover this news and I continue to see both Adobe and Firefly become more and more successful, I've been constantly on the lookout for an artist strike against Adobe, and oddly enough, I haven't seen that happen yet. Now, I've talked about this before. Adobe Firefly can generate a copyright-free image, but it can do so because it's generating based on Adobe stock photos that it just has the license rights to. So it was trained just about as ethically as Stable Diffusion or Midjourney, and from what I've seen, it doesn't have the ability to opt out, which is something that even SDXL has. I actually kind of assumed, as this was a preview, as it eventually grew in popularity, that a lot of the art influencers were going to go anti-Adobe, but it turns out, I guess not. The people that sell drawing tutorials and things like that, it's amazing how they're not boycotting Adobe for a move like this. So I just wanted to point that out. And as we move into the reality where Photoshop, Illustrator, and Express now all have generative AI art creators, I just wanted to remind everyone about that indemnity clause. So if there is a lawsuit for any reason, Adobe covers it. Alright, now in terms of AI art generators, we've got Firefly, which is kind of meh. Stable Diffusion, SDXL 1.0 is actually looking pretty sweet. We've got Midjourney, the newest version is looking amazing, but Meta is coming out of nowhere claiming they've got the best in class for AI generators. This is one that you may not have heard of. I know I hadn't. It's called Chameleon. And here are some examples of exactly what it looks like. Now, this is a different form of graphic design. Stable diffusion, for example, uses a process called latent diffusion, and you can see each of the steps as a graphic is put together. This uses a different process, a process called attention. Now I know a number of people are probably curious, this appears to have been trained on Shutterstock-based imagery. The examples on screen, by the way, these top ones are Meta's new image generator, and these bottom ones are DALL-E 2, which is OpenAI's version. And in another surprise move from Meta, they've opted not to release this one from what I'm seeing. Well, at least not yet. If I get my hands on it or find a way to use it, I'll definitely let you guys know, but yeah, as it stands right now, it doesn't look like they have any immediate plans to release this model to the public. But if that situation changes, of course I'll get my hands on it and give it a shot. So Stability AI has released Stable Doodle, and as they're in the process of going from the 0.9 SDXL model to 1.0, this is something that caught a lot of people by surprise, but it's another tool where you can doodle and have it turn into an amazing piece of art. Now for those of us who've messed with ControlNet or inpainting or anything like that, the idea of this isn't too wild. But I do think that the execution here looks really nice. I haven't had a chance to try it out hands-on, but it seems to have a better interpretation of what you've actually drawn. If you can draw, I guess. But Stability AI, Stability Foundation, whatever you want to call them, they go through a lot of steps, a lot of good steps, a lot of missteps, and this at least seems like a step in the right direction. And I'll say here without much of a preview that what I have seen from SDXL 1.0 looks very promising. So I am actually a little bit excited to get my hands on that real soon here. And I apologize, I know that today's video was lengthy, there was a lot to cover, but as you can see there's a ton of moving and shaking going on in the AI world. It looks like Shutterstock and OpenAI came to a 6-year agreement to work with each other in terms of training. This is actually a really unique deal. You might assume it's just a one-way deal originally, where Shutterstock has got the images, the videos, and the music that OpenAI can train on. But it turns out that OpenAI is also going to be doing their part for Shutterstock. Based on what it says here, that's bringing generative AI to mobile users through Giphy. Now you might remember, and we haven't talked about it in a while because there really hasn't been anything to talk about, but Getty Images has sued OpenAI, for the idea of copyright and things like that. Whereas Shutterstock has kind of taken a very different, very opposite approach. They've fully embraced AI, and they've set up licensing deals for certain things. It says here, Shutterstock's established licensing agreements with NVIDIA, Meta, LG, and others to develop generative AI models and tools across 3D models, images, and text. So it looks like rather than fight against the current, Shutterstock has kind of taken this opportunity to really diversify. It's a very different path, and I suppose we'll have to see which one works out. And as I end today's video, I feel like I should apologize or something. This felt very heavy. There wasn't a lot of fun or exciting stories this week. A lot of LLM announcements, a lot of changes in the regulatory system, a lot of fears and worries. So if you got any fun or exciting stories yourself this week, please drop them in the comments. Let me know what's going on with you, especially if you're using this AI art stuff or anything along those lines. I do appreciate, as always, those of you who made it to the end of the video with me, those of you who interact with the channel in any way. I got a couple of ideas and things that I'm working on in the pipe, but if I don't see you for one of those videos, I'll see you next Friday for another AI news, drama, and updates video. Thank you for watching.